Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And we have a really great event today, and it's even greater because of the news of yesterday. Obviously, the inauguration of President Trump for his second term will certainly have implications for how we think about these questions of bad tech policies. So, one of the things that think tanks do, they really play a bunch of different roles. And one of the roles is to provide analysis of key issues. Another role is to promote new, specific, innovative ideas for policymakers to consider. But a third role, and a critical role, is to call attention to policies that are harmful, and obviously in the view of a particular think tank. And we really have a great panel today because we've got essentially 4 think tank representatives here who put innovation and competitiveness at the center of their work. And so we want to have an opportunity to talk about some of the worst U.S. domestic technology policies of the last year. If we wanted to spread this globally, we could do this for almost days, given how many poorly designed, poorly thought out policies have been introduced around the world in the last year that would hurt innovation. So I'd like to introduce our 4 speakers. The first speaker is my longtime colleague, Jim Lewis. Jim is the Senior Vice President and Pritzker Chair and Director of Strategic Technology Programs at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Sarah O. Lamb is the Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute, TPI. My colleague Hodan Omar is a Senior Policy Manager for ITIF's Center for Data Innovation, and she leads our AI policy work. And last but not least, my longtime colleague, Adam Thayer, who is the resident senior fellow for technology and innovation at the R Street Institute. And Adam has written about, well, everybody's written about this. Adam has a whole book on this, permissionless innovation, which many people have used to their benefit. So why don't we get started? And I think as we went in the order before, it was Hodan, why don't you kick us off? I know a couple of people, there's so many here, it's like low-hanging fruit, really hard to pick the worst. So some people might have 2, but Hodan, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everyone. So my pick today is a proposed state-level AI bill that landed right at the end of last year called the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act, or the TRAGA. And a little bit about this bill. The purpose of TRAGA is to combat algorithmic discrimination, or the notion that an AI system might discriminate, whether intentionally or unintentionally, against a consumer based on protected characteristics such as race, gender, sex, age, or disability status. And to do this, TRAGA casts a really wide net, both in terms of the AI systems it would regulate and also the entities that it would hold accountable. So on the first part, this bill applies to high-risk AI systems that play a substantial role in consequential decisions. That means affecting critical areas like housing, healthcare, employment, or access to basic services like water and utilities. And when we say AI, the way that AI is defined in the bill is quite broad. It's anything that's associated with human intelligence or perception. So that means computer vision systems would be included, speech or natural language processing. All these kinds of technologies would be covered. And in terms of who it applies to, it broadly covers the kind of supply chain of an AI system. So developers, distributors, and deployers all have requirements. For developers, there are things like they would have to prepare detailed high-risk reports explaining all the potential risks that might come to protected groups from these models, as well as the ways that they've been mitigated. For distributors, which are entities that actually make these AI systems commercially available, for them, one of their requirements is if they believe that there is non-compliance, they would be responsible for making sure potentially that comes off of the market. And then for deployers, they would have to complete things like impact assessments for every AI use case. It's every 6 months, but also any time that there is a substantial change to the AI system. And in addition to all of this, the bill would establish a centralized body called the Texas AI Council that would have broad powers to set ethical standards for AI and also issue rules for AI deployment. And so the question becomes, what's wrong with all of that? On the surface, shouldn't that be reasonable or even necessary to have these kinds of requirements, especially for something as important as preventing discrimination? And the answer might have been yes, if the bill would in any way really deliver on that promise. But it's much more likely that it's going to create a lot of progress, but not actually any progress, a lot of paperwork, but not a lot of progress. And actually, what's worse, it's going to frustrate efforts to actually address in a meaningful way, instances of bias or discrimination. And don't mistake me, that is something that we should all be striving for. And so there are kind of three broad reasons why I think that this bill is bad. And the first is the one I've alluded to about why it won't be effective. And that's because the bill really focuses on process and not really on results. So, a developer could tick the box by listing every potential risk, noting down all their training data, and a deployer, could rigorously do their impact assessments and lay out their mitigation plans. But that doesn't really give any insight into how effective or accurate that system is. Is it 90% accurate? Is it 50% accurate? Is it, is it secure? How secure is it? Those aren't answers that you get simply from having this kind of compliance process. And so instead, what regulators should be doing is they should be, focusing on performance, not the process. So for example, rather than requiring a water utility company to document every factor that's used in an AI model that's predicting water shutoffs, or every hospital listing every AI, every variable in an AI tool used for, triaging patients, they should be required to say, this works with X% accuracy and on this age group, and this works with, Y% accuracy on this race or gender. And doing this will mean that, not only are regulators able to set minimum performance requirements, it also means that consumers, businesses, and government have an opportunity to compare performance across different systems. I mean, that's meaningful transparency. That's meaningful accountability. The second problem is kind of at a higher level. The fact that the Texas AI bill really adds to the chaos of America's AI governance approach, and it really detracts from a kind of clear national direction on how to effectively govern these systems. I think, and I know others on this panel can speak to, people often talk about the US approach to technology regulation as a patchwork of, red and blue states and purple states that make it hard for businesses to operate. But I think what's troublesome about this Texas AI bill is it shows that when it comes to AI, it's even messier than that. The governor who introduced this bill said this should be a model for red states. But if you actually read the bill, it's a lot closer to Colorado than it is to the Utah AI bill, right? There is no clear red versus blue divide on how to regulate AI at the state level. It's a free-for-all. For businesses, the result is even more confusion and uncertainty with no clear model to follow. And at the international level, this means that the US has no clear voice, has no clear direction that it can champion and really offer an alternative to the other offerings. The EU's AI model or AI to regulation, or Britain has a very clear vision that it's laid out. China's vision for governance. What is the US governance approach that it's championing? Thankfully, there is actually, the bipartisan House AI task force that came out recently lays out a bipartisan and sensible framework for what that should look like, right? And it's up to every level of government, from Congress to federal agencies to states, to all sing from that same hymn book. And the key parts of that are that it's light touch, that it's focused on evidence-based risks, and critically that it empowers sector-specific regulators. And that brings me on to my final point, which is the problem with the Texas AI bill, which is that it seeks to create a centralized AI body that I was talking about that would issue guidance and rules for a variety of AI systems that cover a myriad of consequential decisions. But there are plenty of examples of why this approach doesn't work. I mean, take New York City's Automated Decision Systems Task Force from 2017. That was a task force that was created to provide advice on how the city government uses AI in areas like predictive policing, school assignments, and compare the scope. That was New York City back in 2017, pre-generative AI, or the way we know generative AI, and the scope is much smaller. And after 2 years, they themselves came out and said this effort has been a failure. In part, it was largely a kind of bureaucratic nightmare. But even if they had been able to overcome the things that were difficult for them, having access to the data they needed to make those the advice that they wanted, having a single body decide on AI decision making in general doesn't make sense for a single body in the same way that it wouldn't work for having a single body that does all human decision making. If we had all the humans that make decisions in hospitals around and all the water companies and all the lawyers and employers, we simply wouldn't do that. And it's the similar logic for why it doesn't work for AI. Sector specific regulators are the people who have the understanding of the unique challenges of their industries and the job at hand, both for states and at the federal level, to make sure that they have the tools that they need and the resources that they need to implement that. So that's my three main reasons why Texas AI bill is bad.
Wonderful, thank you. I feel like this should be one of those game shows, where you vote and all right, everybody who thinks Haaden's got the worst one vote. We actually are going to vote. At the end of everybody's presentation, there will be a Slido link you can go to, and you too can vote for what you think is the worst. And we will show the results at the end of the event. Adam, over to you. You're going to still stay with AI. We could just do a whole panel on bad AI policy, but over to you.
Well, thanks, Rob. And I just want to start by saying that I agree with Odin that the Texas bill is absolutely one of the worst of the past year. And I actually think it's going to end up being my worst of 2025 because the Texas bill or something like it is now pending in many other states, from Connecticut, Virginia, New York, New Mexico, and many others. So stay tuned, because last year's bad bill could become this year's even worse bill. But I'm going to talk about a different measure, a couple of measures actually that are related. But to do so, let me step back just in time just a little bit. 10 years ago, you, Rob, wrote a piece for ITIF asking who is the Luddite of the year. And you even named a winner in that piece. You named it the Luddite of the year for 2014 was, quote, alarmist touting an artificial intelligence apocalypse. Well, you may have been a little bit ahead of your time in that regard, but one thing's for certain, you flash forward about a decade and your warning about the rise of the sort of AI Luddites has really come to a head in a huge way over the past year or two. Specifically in 2023-24, we reached what I would regard as sort of a peak AI techno-panic moment in this country and globally.
Adam, I hope we're at the peak.
I hope so too. I hope so too, but you never know.
Yeah.
The reality is that I don't know if I've ever seen a more radical moment or proposal in my 33 years of doing technology policy than the so-called Pause AI letter and movement, which was spearheaded by the Future of Life Institute. This was a letter that had something like 33,000 signatories from across the globe, which called for a 6-month pause on AI development globally. Practically speaking, the AI pause letter offered us no specific details about how we're going to accomplish this, just suggesting sort of broad-based, controls globally by some unnamed body or bodies. It was really one of the most quixotic policy proposals I've ever seen, but it would have entailed massive controls for computational systems. And despite being so impractical and dangerous, the letter ended up serving its purpose, if you will, because it whipped up quite a panic in the media and generated enormous attention from the press and a variety of pundits, and then from politicians. And this gets to what would be my tie for worst proposal of 2024. It's twofold, but they're really related. One's federal, one's state. At the federal level, we saw a proposal floated for a legislative framework by Senators Blumenthal and Hawley. The so-called Blumenthal-Hawley AI legislative framework would have entailed a big new AI-specific general purpose bureaucracy, top-down general purpose AI licensing of basically all algorithms, sweeping auditing and transparency mandates for algorithmic systems, expanded liability and new private rights of actions after the fact, and their framework would have denied AI innovators any sort of Section 230 protections. This was really sweeping, radical types of top-down control that I've, again, not seen in many, many decades. This was a full-blown precautionary principle regulatory model for AI and advanced computation in the United States. Now, again, that was just a legislative framework. It actually never became a formal bill. It was always floating around, but it did influence many other bills that were floated last session at the federal level. And I think it had some influence at the state level as well, where the absolute worst state bill of the year was introduced in California, which was SB 1047. This bill was proposed as a sort of comprehensive new regulatory regime for advanced computational systems, sort of rooted in fears about hypothetical future harms that might come about but hadn't. The bill established an arbitrary threshold for what constituted powerful frontier AI and critical harms that might flow from them. And the measure also proposed a new sort of regulatory bureaucracy and many reporting requirements, auditing requirements. These onerous mandates and sort of preemptive regulatory processes even received opposition from many notable other politicians, including at the federal level. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi came out pretty aggressively against it, saying the bill would have created, quote, significant unintended consequences that would stifle innovation and harm the U.S. AI ecosystem. She was absolutely right. And for that reason, Governor Gavin Newsom eventually vetoed the bill after the California legislature passed it. But we got very close to getting this measure passed by the most important state in our union. What was wrong? What was so wrong with SB 1047? Well, I think it violated a core tenet of smart technology policy. Regulation should not bottle up underlying system capabilities. It should instead address real-world outputs and outcomes and system performance. Representative Jay Obernolte of California, who chaired the House AI Task Force, he correctly identified in an essay shortly before that bill was dropped why policymakers must avoid AI policies that, quote, stifle innovation by focusing on mechanisms instead of outcomes. And ITF has written eloquently on this, Dan Castro and others, talking about the importance of not trying to go after system processes, but rather look at actual performance, actual real world outcomes. Again, that's the key way to go about governing technology, not the California process. So the lesson of these two measures, the Blumenthal-Hawley bill and SB 1047 in California, is that sweeping technological control regimes are never the right place to start a policy conversation. More limited, incremental, risk-based governance approaches make far more sense, both for normative and practical reasons. The focus of technology policy, again, should be on concrete, identifiable, real-world harms, not hypothetical worst-case scenarios and open-ended fantasies about, that might be pulled from the pages of science fiction novels or television shows. I'd like to say in closing that, we've seen the last of ideas like the Blumenthal-Hawley bill and bills like California's SB 1047, but these Luddite ideas still have legs, unfortunately. It's already been made clear that SB 1047 is coming back this session, and there might be some cookie cutter types of proposals that pop up at the state level in this coming year. So stay tuned to this, because as you suggested, Rob, I think there still, unfortunately, could be a little bit more techno panic to come. Thanks.
Adam, one of the big problems with that 6 months pause is it would have really, really jacked up the unemployment insurance claims because, poor CS folks, what are they going to do for 6 months? They can go collect unemployment insurance and then they can get back to their cause of destroying the world. Well, that's a great one. So now we have two. Sarah, over to you.
Great.
With one, and then we'll come back to your second one after Jim.
Okay. Thanks for having me. I'm Sarah Lamb from TPI. So the program I'll talk about is the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Broadband Subsidy Program. It was part of the IIJA bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law. So if you think back to 2021, 4 years ago, that's when the money was allocated. $42 billion in broadband subsidy. It was part of a very large package of $1.2 trillion in spending, which was increased from an initial like $500 billion infrastructure package. So just thinking back to that time, it was post-COVID. It was a part of a stimulus bill, infrastructure week. So it feels like a long time ago because 4 years later, as FCC Chair Brendan Carr has tracked, over 1,000 days, we don't have broadband yet from the BEAD program, and there's been a lot of activity in getting all the state broadband offices set up, the challenge process, the rules, the guidelines. But here we are 4 years later, and we haven't seen build out yet. So the reason why I chose this program is because, well, one, it's not too late. So now, since the money hasn't really been spent yet, and there's a new NTIA administrator coming in, possibly Senate Commerce staffer Ariel Roth. I don't think she's been formally nominated yet, but her name is floating. Yeah, there's a lot that I think there are tweaks that can be made to the BEAD program still. And so as administrator, I'd be curious to see what the next administration can do. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about just the posture of the program itself and ways that it can be maybe, I don't know, improved upon or made more efficient. So first of all, I think in watching the way BEAD development has happened, the emphasis is all on spending. So we get rewarded for spending. But the evaluation and the outcomes are not tracked as carefully. So I remember in the early parts of the rules, there were efforts to try and put metrics in to have the states report back to track where how the money was spent longitudinally afterwards. I don't see that in the current documents that NTIA put out for the grant applications. They don't really emphasize evaluation or unit costs or price competition. There is like talk about, yes, we want the best bang for our buck, but structurally, NTIA didn't require the states to do any kind of reverse auctions or procurement auctions. They really left it up to the states to do what they wanted. You could say that federalism principles would point to, okay, well, the local governments will want to use money wisely and know where to put the money. And you can see in the challenge process dashboards for each of the states, like it seems like that was a good outcome. You can see that a lot of challenges came in, and the maps have highlighted areas where local people at each state can identify, this area has or does not have data broadband as claimed. So there are some bright spots in the way the whole program has played out, but then there are also like major flaws in the whole apparatus. NTIA could really do better at learning how these programs are operating. So they could require the states to send back like systematic metrics and costs and numbers report back, so that scholars and economists can study the program. BTOP was from 2010. If you all remember the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, at the time, $4.7 billion felt like a big program through the Recovery Act. But 11 years later, BEAD is 10 times larger, so $42 billion. And it's really actually interesting that when I was studying BTOP, I thought the documentation was opaque. Like NTIA at the time had posted all the grant application documents, so we could see, the application documents for the accepted projects, but they didn't post the application documents for all the projects that just proposed and were not accepted. This NTIA hasn't made that documentation transparent, so we don't have those documents. I think the next NTIA could make that documentation transparent so that we can see like what the states are proposing, outside of what they have published. So I think there's just a lot that I think the last administration, patted themselves on the back for doing a great job getting the word out, but really, like, when we're trying to learn from the spending and trying to think about outcomes and the next round, if there is one, presumably every 10 years, the government wants to spend money on broadband, at least we'll know more about what has worked in the past and what our money has purchased. So I think that just some quibbles about the whole, accountability and regard for results and evaluation rather than just spending.
Sarah, thank you. We had talked earlier and also about they seem to have this Susan Crawford, like the only good technology is fiber technology, and satellites are worthless, and fixed wireless is worthless, and cable's worthless, and fiber is very expensive. Anyway, can you also? I know you've been thinking about that as well. Do you want to just spend a minute or two on that?
Yeah, sure. So January 2nd, right before this change of administration, the NTIA put out an alternative tech provider's final notice. So they'd been hearing a lot of complaints about, favor to fiber and disfavor to other technologies. So they did mention, we're going to make it easier for LEO satellites and unlicensed fixed wireless to be a part of this program. I think it's just problematic that a $42 billion program would not be technologically neutral. I think one thing that maybe is a benefit of them not being so slow 4 years later is that it's very apparent that certain technologies are faster at connecting Americans for cheaper, like the LEO satellites. So maybe it's not too late to change those grants and to get more bang for the buck for Americans. So, I mean, I think this is a critique of any government program. You have like interest groups that want part of the government money, and so they're going to be lobbying for it, which is not always aligned with what's the best bang for the buck for Americans and for the digital divide and connectivity.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. You mentioned transparency, which when you look at all of this stuff, it's striking how untransparent it is. I was on this little fool's errand for half an hour trying to find out how many miles of road do you think we've built with all that money into transportation? I'm thinking it might actually be negative because I know the big push was to tear down freeways. But in all seriousness, I approached the DOT and I got a spreadsheet, which was fairly worthless. I would have had to spend 6 or 7 months going into each one and reading what it actually did to figure out just what did we do with all that money. And the same thing with hydrogen hubs. Our analyst Robin Gaster's been looking at that. There's almost no transparency. So the least that government, and Adam, you know me, I don't say this as a necessarily a small government conservative. I say this as I want good government. The least we can do is have transparency about data, Sarah, as you rightly alluded to. That to me is the baseline, and we just haven't been doing that. So, Jim, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everyone. The hard part in preparing for this was there are just so many candidates for worst tech policy of 2024 that it was hard to pick. And I thought about why is that the case? And there's some common themes in all of them. The first is a distrust of markets and market outcomes. It's better to have people at the NSC pick the winners rather than let the market decide. I think that's a good plan. Some of it was COVID. People got used to not being able to rely on markets during COVID and supply chains during COVID. And some of it, of course, is the unhappiness, deservedly so, with letting China into the WTO and giving it a non-market economy free reign in the global market. So you can see why people don't trust markets. China's part of this too. There's a lot of confusion over what to do over China. We're still working through what a good policy would be. My favorite example is higher fences over fewer goods. Some of you may have known him, Mitch Wallerstein, who was at the National Academy of Sciences in the 1980s, coined that phrase. I'm a little suspicious about whether a policy that is entering its 40th year is still valuable. Finally, as we've heard in all the others, there's been slow implementation. And that might just be a problem across the board. It was a problem for this administration, but it's good to set programs in place. It's good to announce things, but it's not good to actually produce results. And there's too much of that. So the one I picked was, of course, semiconductors and chips, because they're close to my heart and because they don't have the letters AI in them, which is a plus, although we're going to have to talk. It's impossible not to talk about AI, right? So in its final moments, the administration issued a complex, lengthy regulation that basically gives more authority to the governments to allocate chip supplies, to restrict exports. Its length alone is a hint that it might be a good candidate for worst policy. This is sort of like Gosplan. The piece I'm working on is called Gosplan on the Potomac, where you have the federal government allocate how many chips a country can get. A lot of this has to do with the ghost of the revolution in military affairs, RMA. So in 1990, which was probably the high point of American power, we won a war very quickly, unexpectedly, because of our technological advantage. And this was the result of investments made in technology a decade or two earlier, right? So it's not a bad strategy for the 20th century. The question is, does it work now in a very different economy, global economy? I think the answer is probably not, but there's this hope that if we can somehow deny the Chinese access to the chips they need for artificial intelligence, it will handicap them militarily and economically. We don't always say economically, but that is part of the goal. Competing with China drives a lot of this, and it drives a lot of the confusion. It's not going to be easy to disentangle. That's not exactly a newsflash. But some of the things we've done have, as we've heard with other initiatives, probably done as much harm to American companies as they have to Chinese companies, right? The starting point of this administration, which I agreed with and thought was a good idea, was end items could go to China, but not capital goods, not semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That's not a bad policy. It's probably too late because unfortunately we did both. And the Chinese, who have a lot of talent and a lot of money, decided they would build their own, right? And so that's one of the problems we've had with this policy is it's not there isn't an iron curtain. The ability to create substitutes to rely on global markets undercuts some of the solutions we developed for the Cold War. And one of the other things I'd look at in worst technology policies is sort of a nostalgia for the Cold War, when we could control technology, when we had strong alliances, when there weren't non-Western competitors. There's a lot of examples of that. I just showed drones as one where we can say no and the rest of the world just moves on. So for me, a complex regulation that substitutes government decision-making for markets and that probably is confused about its strategic objectives. We didn't talk about that, and I'll just throw that in. what are the right metrics for saying something is a bad policy? And so I would look at market share, maybe some ill-defined technological leadership, GDP growth in general, military strength to the extent you can measure it. These policies are sort of outcome free. They've also been slow. The CHIPS Act, one of the things to ask with that is, are we more or less dependent on Northeast Asia for advanced chips than we were at the start of this? Unfortunately, the answer is more, right? So we had a goal, we didn't make it. And I think that qualifies this as one of the worst, if not the worst, of 2024.
Jim, thank you. I think one of the things would be interesting about this, maybe we can noodle on, is are there underlying themes behind all of this? And I think one of the themes is less than full understanding of the suite of technologies and how they work and how they're developed. Because Sarah, in your case, it was underestimated LEOs, even though people who follow this, it's like, yeah, we all knew LEOs were going to kind of be this real alternative now for the first time. Jim, in your case, it's talking about, underestimating the capability of the Chinese in terms of getting workarounds. And in the AI case, it's just not knowing how the technology works and panicking. Sarah, you had a second one, so why don't we go back to you?
Okay. Yeah, as another policy that was kind of frustrating to watch, it was the spectrum reauthorization gridlock. I think I understand that it was kind of a political, there are a lot of constituencies that are, holding up spectrum reauthorization for different reasons. But it just seems like unfortunate that the FCC, as like experts in spectrum auctions, like really can't like do studies or work or like do small auctions, or that they're just hamstrung from having authority to run auctions because it's being held up in Congress. So, I think that, I understand there are reasons why it's held up, but it just seems like counterproductive for our government agencies and our industries to have that kind of gridlock. So, hopefully that this Congress, there'll be more, I guess, deal making or negotiating or just progress in certain bands not holding up the rest of spectrum.
Yeah, thank you. As Joe Kane, who leads our broadband and wireless work, he's also written extensively on that we really do need innovation in how we think about and manage spectrum. There's a lot to be done to free up and make it more of a market. So absolutely. Jim, I think you had a second. I don't know that we quite got to it.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if I did as well, but I think one of the policies a set of policies that seems to be sort of roaming around the desert looking for inspiration or manna or something is the treatment of social media. This is a global phenomenon. You've got the Australians, you've got the European Union, you've got others stepping in and saying, this is a thing that creates political risk. I would tend to agree with them. The marketplace of ideas isn't working or hasn't worked. And so the idea is, what should take its place? How can we substitute? Perhaps government intervention. But the fact that it's a hard problem means we're groping towards a solution, not that we found it. So I would put all the social media is a real problem. You can define all the problems, the effect on children, the effect on politics, the growth of fraud and crime, the encouragement of largely far-right sentiment, but we haven't figured out how to deal with that. And whatever solution we had in the last century isn't working now. So I think in that category of worst policies, I'd put a lot of the efforts that we've seen, mainly in Europe, but in other places as well. I'd be interesting to know what the group thinks or what the audience thinks about DMA and DSA. They're also candidates, but I think this how do you deal with the digital environment has engendered a set of policies that are either harmful or silly or damaging. So I put that in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. You look at some of the people, not all of them, but some of the people who've been prosecuted in the UK for saying things online. They certainly don't appear to have the same commitment to the First Amendment that we would have. And yet there are people who want to emulate that here in the US, just in my view, really, really troubling. I would add, people, the poll should go up. It should be up. You should see it if you want to vote on it. That'd be cool. And also, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them, and I'll see them. I want to raise, obviously, the $64,000 question, or the elephant in the room. We saw President Trump yesterday in his inauguration. We saw a number of technology CEOs in the Capitol with him. We also saw a number of executive orders that he issued in his first day in office. I think anybody who says they think they know what's going to happen, I think is foolish. Obviously you can't predict what's going to happen with any administration. But I will say one thing it seems like is that perhaps we've reached, as David Moschel and I wrote in our book recently, the book Technology, Fears and Scapegoats, that the Biden administration was the first techlash administration we've ever had. It seems maybe that we've reached peak techlash. Adam, I know you had said earlier that maybe we'd reached peak bad AI, but I'm just curious if people want to sort of jump in. Do you think we've reached peak techlash, at least in the United States, with President Trump now?
I don't know. I'm a little bit worried about this. I'm going to go back to another thing that you wrote, Rob. This is why you have me at your events, Rob, is because I go back and I publicize all your old books that have been long since forgotten. But 21 years ago, you wrote in your book on the past and future of America's economy about the development of a new major fault line in American politics. And you talked about the divide between the so-called preservationists versus the modernizers. And you said in chapter 6, I have it right in front of me, this conflict between stability and progress, security and prosperity, dynamism and stasis has led to the creation of a major political fault line in American politics. I think at the time you wrote that, it was very prescient. I don't think we were there yet with the full-blown sort of panics we see today, but now it is upon us in a major way. This is the world we live in, and the political fault lines are not quite as bright in the terms of R&D side as they used to be. I think clearly the Biden administration did have a lot of techno-panicky kind of rhetoric. I mean, on just AI alone, if you read the AI Bill of Rights, it was just dripping just with dystopian dread and fear about the future. And, the positive elements of AI and computational power were given sort of like a secondary treatment or consideration. It was all just layering on like grievances and potential harms. But that being said, we've seen from the MAGA world and Mr. Trump himself a lot of his own grievances about social media, about digital technology. Let's not forget we had an entire weaponization commission in the House run by Jim Jordan, and a lot of the focus was on social media. We had Republican governors and AGs pushing social media related lawsuits all the way to the Supreme Court. We had a bill like COSA, which was another one of my nominees for the worst bills of last year, the Kids Online Safety Act, that is a comprehensive sort of online safety regulation that would really start to usher in sort of full-blown age verification and potential censorship of the internet in a way that we, thought we had beaten back a generation ago. So there's a lot of modernizers versus preservationists. Going back to your dichotomy there, Rob, there's a lot of preservationists, and they're preservationists not just of specific professions or industries, which was a lot of what you talked about in your book. It's now also about preservation of certain cultural norms or values. And people just don't like to see the status quo disrupted, whatever that status quo may be. And so I don't know how the Trump administration will come down on a lot of these things. We face a really interesting moment right now where you have this alliance of sort of the Silicon Valley tech bros and the MAGA populists. And they seem very cozy and friendly right now, and they all sit next to each other at the inauguration awkwardly, even though, I mean, did you see Mark Zuckerberg sitting next to Lindsey Graham or close to him? I mean, Lindsey Graham was calling out Zuckerberg as like an enemy of the American people and saying he was killing our kids at a hearing last year. I mean, what a surreal world we live in that they're now sitting there at the same event celebrating the ascendancy of Trump back to the White House. So these political alliances and its fault lines, as you call them, Rob, they're really interesting and ever shifting. And the panics sort of come and go. And what I've argued in my work is that it used to be that techno panics or moral panics, they crested and fell slower than they do today. We had like long-standing panics about rock and roll music and rap in the 80s, and then it was video games in the 90s. These were like decade-long panics. Well, now the panics come at us like one after another, year after year. And so there's always going to be like a perpetual state of techno panic, I would argue. And maybe there's a crowding out effect of one panic crowding out another. So it remains to be seen how this plays out in the Trump world. But I would predict, and I've got a piece coming out later this week about this, that this tech bro and MAGA populist alliance starts to slowly break apart. We already saw it breaking apart over immigration before Trump even took office. There was like a war between these people on Twitter about immigration policy for like HB1s and high skilled immigration. But there's tensions about things like social media issues like Jim raised. There's tensions about even things like certain types of autonomous systems. There have been some conservatives who fear things like driverless cars and drones and stuff and say, I'm going to shoot them down and throw over my property. You know, the political alliances and fault lines and parties are changing. So I'm not sure who the new modernizers or preservationists are, and I have to pick my friends every day of the week, I guess.
Well, Adam, what I would have liked to have seen was Steve Bannon sitting next to Zuckerberg. I thought that would have been a really good image.
But Rob,
yeah, we'll see.
I think, Rob,
Go ahead.
Techlash is in a lull, right? But it's going to come back. And so I would describe our current period as one of sullen discontent, right? There's the concerns over social media. But the ultimate driver is our failure, yet again, it's a swing and a miss to come up with a privacy law. And you have some good examples. Fortunately for us, the Europeans showed how not to do it if you don't want to damage your economy. But as people become more dependent on this stuff, as they realize more of what's being done, and you saw a little of that, this will come back in the midterms. The oligarchy comment, a bit cheap, but also some truth. So between privacy, between cottoning up to rich people, techlash is currently in a lull, but it'll be back.
I think what's also interesting is President Trump's comments on TikTok. So I saw at the desk he was signing, and he said, you know, that China has information on our young people's dance videos. It seems like we have bigger problems than that. So it seems like there's a little bit of good cop, bad cop. Like, you know, maybe this administration, they know the dangers of TikTok, but, you know, let's wait and see what we can do to work it out. Or so I think even the TikTok position is a little divisive too. There are definitely China hawks that are on Team MAGA, and they disagree with Trump's being extending the ban for TikTok. So I think tech, and then also just agree, having American tech CEOs up there is a big vote of confidence for American business. I saw that as kind of a symbol to China. Like, here are our American tech companies right up here, and so I think it'll be interesting to see how everything plays out in terms of the details.
Yeah, Sarah, you know, the related point to that, I'm going to go to Adam here, is we see this sort of tension and conflict also in the appointees. So if you look at some of the Trump FTC, FCC, DOJ appointees, several of them are tech skeptics, perhaps, shall you say, and worry that tech has too much power. So we certainly don't appear to have gone back to kind of the old consumer welfare standard in antitrust and the pro-innovation approach that we used to have, even under Obama. So it again suggests lots of different competing forces, and hopefully will work out. Adam.
Well, just building on that point, Rob, I think this is another sort of major policy development over the past couple of years. It's hard to name any one particular antitrust policy, but taken together, there's been a sort of antitrust jihad by the last administration, specifically Lena Khan's FTC, but also folks at the DOJ, to really get quite aggressive on this. But what's been most interesting about this moment and the move to abandon the consumer welfare standard, as you pointed out, is that you've had meta conservatives joining on. They've basically been cheering that on, and even JD Vance and others have suggested that they're sympathetic to that. So I think that's sort of a continuing sort of techlash that will last throughout the Trump years. The key question there, and Sarah alluded to it, is to what extent you'll get the corresponding pushback from the sort of national security hawks and others who will say, well, if you care about countering China on advanced technological capabilities, you can't go around kneecapping America's leading digital technology companies. And Rob, you made this point in one of your old books, Big is Beautiful. Here I am again. You might as well be paying me at this point, Rob.
I feel like you're definitely my St. Paul. So thank you.
I'm your marketing agent at this point. But in Big,
more like a St. Bernard.
In Big is Beautiful, you pointed this out, that like it's easy to go around bashing large technology companies or large companies, period. But at the end of the day, they're hugely supportive of the R&D engine of the nation. And I can't remember the latest data that I think it was last summer, I saw something like 335 billion of investment in data centers by the 6 largest digital technology companies in America. And that was something like 5 or 6x what China was investing altogether. That's incredible. We should be applauding that. But every one of those companies that had been making those investments were under some sort of antitrust investigation. And were being named by Republicans, including Trump himself, as sort of like enemies of the people. So stay tuned on that one, folks, because it's not really clear how that one will be resolved, but that'll just be a continuing sort of backlash or techlash.
Yeah, we can only hope that the folks who take national security and China seriously win that debate, because I got to tell you, that's way more important to the future of our country than if a company has a little bit more market share or not. Hadan, you wanted to mention this, how that plays out in AI and what we might see.
Well, just kind of listening to what we've been talking about, thinking about these kind of competing forces, I think with things like privacy, there was a debate over one kind of large bill and what that looks like. That's not what happens with AI, right? Like there is no single AI bill that we are pulling and pushing against. It's several different bills that come out that all add up to one approach. And that's why it's so important to really have a kind of very specific target and vision for what those bills should be speaking to. Because the competing forces put different parts on the board.
So one of the problems I think that we all have, and my wife, who's a clinical social worker, explains this to me all the time, that rationality doesn't always win against emotion, as much as I wish and hope it does. But in all seriousness, though, the other side can say things like, are you really for discrimination against protected groups? Are you really for that? Do you really want the human race to die? Are you defending oligarchs? And what about the little guy? What about small business? I mean, these are just all heartstring, fear-inducing emotional pulls. And the other side, and I say the other side, Adam, broadly, I'm really talking about statists. I'm talking about people who just don't want change. Playing the fear card is one of the most powerful and effective things they can do. And I just ethically can't do it. I don't want to do that. I think it's irresponsible. Maybe we can play the hope card instead of the fear card. And I just wonder what you all think about how do we do this better?
Yeah, I've written a lot about this. And in my book on permissionless innovation, I have an entire chapter about why it is that defenders of innovation and progress are always on our heels, always playing a game of defense, and how hard it is for us to go on offense. And I identified 6 different primary rationales or reasons why that happens. But I really think a lot of it goes back to the simple truth that bad news sells. That basically, many media outlets and political pundits and politicians themselves, they love to play to fear, and they also are sort of, their brains are marinated in dystopian dread from science fiction novels and television shows about AI and robotics or whatever else, and sort of fear mongering and prophecies of doom end up being the prevailing narrative that we're responding to. I mean, I'll never forget at the most astonishing hearing I saw on AI policy, maybe the most astonishing one on tech policy period in 30 years, was in 2020. It was in May of 2023 on AI, where Sam Altman was testifying. And one of the senators, who shall remain nameless, but was a Republican, said that when we talk about AI, we should begin from the presumption that all AI systems want to kill us. And so that was the Terminator scenario brought to the front lines of public policy and like leading our debate and our narrative. And then you're stuck responding to the Terminator. And I've been literally in debates on Capitol Hill with staffers and others who get very frustrated after I lay out all the facts and identify all the trade-offs. But they'll say, yeah, but didn't you see last night's episode of Black Mirror on HBO? And you're like, well, or on Netflix, and that's where we stand in these debates, is that people have their mental frame shaped by worst case scenarios. And then you add into that the fact that you have special interests who are, again, you're preservationists, Rob, who are trying to hold on to something about the past, and they just don't want to let it go. And there was a Democratic representative, former representative, Jim Cooper, here I've got the quote in front of me, who once famously observed, quote, "The past in general is overrepresented in Washington. The future has no lobbyists." And that's true. Who lobbies for the future? Who cares about things that are not yet built or that we want to dream about until they're there? But then, unfortunately, a lot of people, they're there and they're like, well, let's preserve that status quo. That's all we want. And so these combined forces are really, really toxic to public policy debates and leave all of us on our heels pushing back. The one thing I'll say here, though, is that we have one major advantage, which is that technology does continue to move fast. And some academics complain about that and say, this is a pacing problem. The fact that pace of technological change is equal to or faster than legislative change sometimes. And I often respond, well, one man's pacing problem is another man's pacing benefit. Because I love that. I love the fact that it keeps government on its heels. And in fact, my last book was all about this, about how that sort of evasive entrepreneurialism and like quick moving, quicksilver technological change actually is like a new form of checks and balances on governance. Keeps people on the government side on their toes and having to focus on like what really matters. But at the end of the day, the bad news still is what leads. And if it bleeds, it leads. But if it's just anything bad news about tech, it's going to be the headline.
There's a book not written by Rob or Adam or anyone else on the call called The Bet. And it's a funny book because it's a bet, of course, between a climate doom person and an economist about what the outcome will be and, of course, the climate. But the nice thing about the book is there's loads of examples in it. For example, predictions that we were entering an era of famine in the 1960s, that the UK would be facing starvation in the year 2000. It's just, there's some cultural thing going on, and I'm not quite sure why, but it's more, the media accelerates it. The media will tell stories that, one, appeal to it, and two, will sell. But this is a deeper cultural phenomenon. We've lost the confidence that existed, say, before the global wars of the mid 20th century.
Yeah, this was a book with Paul Ehrlich, The Population Bomb,
Right.
that, and I think her, wasn't it Simon?
Yeah.
Julian Simon.
Julian Simon. Just a quick aside, and then I want to go to Sarah. We actually had an Annenberg fellow, PhD fellow, come in one summer and did a very interesting study where we looked at 3 or 4 or 5 major publications, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and looked at, I think, over 300 technology stories from the 80s to the present. And we did sort of kind of a content analysis. Are they generally positive? Or are they generally not? And what we found, to nobody's surprise, vast decline in positive and a big giant increase in negative. I always remember talking to a reporter about, I don't know if you remember Catherine Albrecht and her fear that that RFIDs were the mark of the devil, 666, and we're going to take over. And I'm sure I'm being tracked by somebody right now with my key fob, which I still can't get to open the door because I got to jam it next to it. But that was going to be the thing, and so the reporter writes all about that, but doesn't talk about the wonderful benefits of RFID tags, making our lives simpler. Sarah.
Yeah, about the Terminator analogy. Back in 2019, before the pandemic, TPI, we had an all-day conference on AI. That was when neural nets were popular and machine learning, before ChatGPT, the boom. But we had a full-day conference, and it was themed Jetsons or Terminator. And it is that dichotomy. Do we want Rosie helping us at home? Yes, definitely. Do we have fear of a Terminator? Yes, that too. So I think it's both. But maybe we forget, yeah, the Jetsons ideal was that Rosie could help us with our lives and make life better. And so I think maybe that is like part of the positive story from AI that we can forget if you're an AI doomer. But then I also you get the sense that you hear all these new developments like AGI or O3, or the next models are coming soon that are like even smarter than our current models. And and robotics, you add AI to like physical realm and robots, and you get a much different landscape. So I think, if I were to give a prediction, I feel like 6 months or 1 year from now, the conversation's going to be different. I don't know if it'll just be heightened on both sides, like positive, negative. But there's definitely and then on the positive side too, like there's just so much that can be done for healthcare and pharmaceuticals. Like, let's cure cancer, like if AI can do that hard stuff, then like wonderful, great. It can reduce frictions on our lives. There's just so much low hanging fruit that AI could help make our lives better, and the US more prosperous. But then, yeah, the Terminator side is a real thing. You add AI to military weapons and you put them in an adversarial nation state, and the thing about adversaries is you can't defend to the max of their motivation. So everything's going to look weak to an adversary. You can't spend all your money defending against every possible vulnerability. And so that's tricky when you have an adversary. So I think, 6 months, 1 year from now, like what we can depend on is that, economic growth creates more opportunity, both directions. And so you would want that more than deflation or degrowth. So that's the one thing I would hang my hat on, that okay, let's favor growth and figure out the policy issues along the way.
So Sarah, why do you hate the climate?
Yeah, right. Well, my dad is an astronomist, and he talks about the orbits, and we're on 1,000-year cycles. So the Earth is on like one of those orbits where it's close to the sun right now, and then it'll go farther. So I don't know. It depends on how much science you want to depend on, and what your time frame is. But
See, I think what we're going to end up with is we're going to have, how you see all these, especially if you live in the suburbs, you see these like the Mary Maid and these companies that, provide, house cleaning services. I think they're going to lobby against house cleaning robots. These people depend on this for jobs, and how dare we, give people house cleaning robots? It's be awful. Jim, were you going to jump in?
No, I think that it's a question for me. One of my goals for last year was to keep Silicon Valley safe from Washington, because we have a growth machine that keeps cranking along, irrespective in some ways of what policy can be. There's beneficial policies and the framework is beneficial, but you know the fear about technology is not yet so overwhelming that it's damaged growth. And to Sarah's point, it's not clear to me when you talk to everyone in the European Union that they have a pro-growth agenda. And the Draghi report was not met with universal acclaim. So people might be saying, and you can find Europeans who will say this, we have a nice life. Why should we do this rat race growth thing? But I think I agree with Sarah that growth gives you more opportunities. And if it doesn't happen here, it will happen somewhere else.
We hope it happens, absolutely. But the amount of, the fact that Nobel Prize winning economists, I wrote an article in the journal Independent Review out of California a year and a half ago, called I forget, it was the abandonment of growth and the decline of the West. And the argument was that the West, Adam, this goes back to your point earlier. We didn't hear these, if you heard these things, they were kind of like the guy with the tinfoil hat. It was like, you remember that you can't get in the way of progress, And there's this part of America where we had that innately sort of optimistic risk taking, and actually, President Trump talked about that in his inauguration. I thought that was a really powerful point he made about that historically America has taken big risks. We have moved forward, but that has to include technological innovation. That can't just be, we're going to drill some more oil or we're going to build a few more bridges or something. That has to be technological innovation, and giving that up, would be problematic. So.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Rob. And I think in this way, this was maybe in a macro sense, one of the biggest mistakes of the Biden presidency is that a lot of the tech community was very much in his corner originally. They were in Obama's corner, and certainly going back all the way to the Clinton days, they were in Bill Clinton's corner, and rightly so, because there was more of an optimistic tone and approach taken, especially during the Clinton-Gore days, to exactly the issues you're talking about, to entrepreneurialism, to risk-taking, to thinking boldly about how technological innovation can help grow our economy in the ways that Sarah and Jim suggested. And I think that was missing during a lot of the Biden presidency. And just to put a fine point on this, how, policy ideas have real world consequences, and going back to what Jim had to say about Europe, I mean, we've got the data on this. I mean, of the 25 largest digital technology companies in the world, 19 of them are US based. Only one is in Europe. Of the 50% of the biggest digital employers in the world are US headquartered. Only a few are in Europe. All total, I think, was something like the Bureau of Economic Analysis said $4 trillion worth of gross output to the economy, thanks to the digital economy. I mean, these are huge numbers, and we have to tether that back, connect it back to the policy decisions we made as a nation a quarter century ago that were very much bipartisan, but realistically driven more by the Clinton-Gore administration than the Republican Congress. And I remember when I was going around cheerleading for like what Clinton-Gore were doing on this front in the mid-90s when I worked at the Heritage Foundation. And a lot of my, coworkers looked at me like, what are you, some sort of communist or something? What's going on here, Fear? And I'm like, no, these guys are doing the Lord's work. This is awesome. This is really exciting what's going on. And now the fruits of that have been seen. And all of these companies that we have that are household names across the world are an example of how we can get it right when policy is not driven by the precautionary principle. And so I hope that there's still chance for that. And I really hope, and I think it demands a turnaround by the Democrats to actually get back on board a pro-progress abundance agenda and embrace policies that they once took for granted and supported. But I think they got lost. And I think just one final point I'll make about this that shows you how lost they were. I mean, look at what happened during the dock worker strike last year and the Hollywood strike. I mean, everybody was a lot of people on the left were falling all over themselves to defend them and bash AI. And AI was at the center of that, right? That's a technological storm that's just really disturbing, because you suggested, Rob, everybody's going to oppose the next, advanced Roomba that comes in as potentially taking some house cleaner's job. Where does it end? You've got to embrace that sort of change for the benefits for productivity and for broader based benefits for our health and for our economy and everything else. But it remains to be seen how our parties come out on that.
So it's worth noting. It's
Go ahead,
worth
Jim.
noting. Thank you, Rob. It's worth noting that for whatever reason, we still have the most innovative economy in the world, and that's one of the reasons it's the biggest. And the mystery remains as to how that works sometimes, but we're not the only ones who can do it. It's not the 20th century competitors. It may not be the Europe. It may not be the Japan, although Japan's getting better. But you're going to see the Indias, the Chinas, maybe the Turkeys, maybe the Brazils. It won't be the same innovation, and it probably won't be fast. But if we agreed now that this is bad, we'll take a 6-month break. I think it's not a Western phenomenon anymore. It's a global phenomenon, and those places probably would not agree with us and step on the brake. So
that's what's even more puzzling about it, because back when Clinton and Gore talked about, they had this catchphrase, building a bridge to the 21st century. And what they meant by that was the 21st century is a great place to be. In other words, this unknown, this place with all this new technology. But what they said was, we're going to help workers make the transition, make skills and all that. We're going to help people to get there. And what's striking to me is, I don't know how bad the political damage is to the Democratic Party with the tech community and how long-standing it is, but it's pretty serious. I mean, Clinton and Gore went out to Silicon Valley in '92, and they basically changed the Valley. The Valley had been Republican through the '80s, very Reagan, then Bush. And then, Obama built onto that. He was, the first BlackBerry president. And now you see that from the inauguration yesterday, that there's so much disenchantment and frustration with what the Biden administration did, both on the regulatory front and also especially on the antitrust front, but also getting rid of the whole trade agreement for data flows. That was outrageous. So I think the Democratic Party has to really think about what it wants to be. Does it want to be a party that just no longer gets support from the technology community, and maybe it'll get enough support from the Screen Actors Guild and the Lawyer Guild and the train workers and the other people who don't want change, but it's a little bit harder to go on.
And do you think, Rob, part of that is like the European posture. It seems like, it's better to uphold human dignity and status quo than destructive or creative destruction. And to me, that sounds very European, the European approach, although they wouldn't say it like that. I don't know if Europe is also tilting away from that perspective because they see they're falling behind.
Yeah, I was going to say quickly, and then 100%, I think the Democratic Party, and I say this, Adam, and that I'm Progressive Policy Institute, centrist Democrat. I think the Democratic Party has become much more of a European social democratic party, and John Judas has written about that extensively and very well. And in that social democratic world, what you privilege is stability. We've almost gotten to the point now. You listen to the narratives. We've almost gotten to the point now where it's like it's almost immoral for a worker to lose their job. And if that's the case, then my 2 kids are going to have the same standard of living opportunities that I have, which to me would be a horrendous thing. Oh my gosh, are you kidding me? We can't live in a world like that. Our next generation has to have 25% better opportunities. And the next one after that, 30%. So other thoughts? We can wrap up a little early. There's maybe one last question, which would be, if you're working on the Hill and you're being inundated with the fire hose, which is what working on the Hill is about. And a lot of the water that's being flooded at you is more on the stasis side. How do you think more carefully about this? How do you get your boss to think more carefully about, wait a minute, there's an innovation side here, and that's really the side we need to be on? Thoughts on that?
I would certainly say that, the more thoughtful approach is to always take a cautious one of forbearance and studying the issues before you rush to act. And I want to put in a good word here for what the bipartisan House AI Task Force did late last year in the report that it released. It was a year-long study that was led in a bipartisan way by Representatives Jay Obernolte and Ted Lieu, both California representatives. And they did a wonderful job of offering up a vision for how to take a more thoughtful look at AI policy and computational issues, more of a wait and see approach. They did recommend some regulations here and there, but it's really where we should have started the debate about AI policy was where they did. But it took them months of study with a huge staff effort at the Science Technology Task Force, and that's a better approach. I think if we could take that for all issues, the next great tech panic to come will probably be neurotechnology or something like that, and we'll have immediate panics on that, people trying to rush to regulate. But that's another area, like many other emerging tech issues, where we just need to take a very close look and pause a little bit and think about it and forbear. Forbearance is really the key principle here. Forbearance and humility. That's what I always talk about when I think about a world of sort of driven by the innovation principle or permissionless innovation. It's not a world of anarchy. We sometimes do need rules. We already have a lot of regulations. We need to account for those, figure out how we can improve them, fill in the gaps, but first study and understand before we rush to act.
I just quickly would add to that. I thought the Schumer, Young, I'm sorry, I'm going to get, I think there were 4 senators bipartisan. I thought their effort was quite good. It wasn't hearings. It was just bring in a bunch of experts, listen. So I think the listening mode is a very important one, as you noted. Sarah, kind of this as closing remarks, I'll maybe go to you next. Thoughts on that?
On forbearance, I think the state patchwork will be an issue for this coming year for sure. Hopefully there'll be more forward movement in the Congress. I don't know what folks think, if there will be privacy legislation, if there will be AI legislation, just to keep that patchwork at bay. So I think looking at the coming year, hopefully the whole government efficiency posture will make just prioritize streamlining, build out innovation. It's good to hear that NEPA exemptions are on the table, and other time-consuming hurdles to build out and growth. For software, I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see with all these tech people in close to the administration, what their influence will be.
Great, thank you. Harlan, over to you.
Adam already covered the federal side, so I started my comments with what states shouldn't be doing. So what should states be doing? And there is work for them to do. Regulatory clarity is one important area, and I think in general Utah's doing a good job of this, figuring out what laws already are being applied, where is there room for things to be done, working with the local ecosystem, really thinking about or gathering information on what the local ecosystem thinks. Second is setting standards for government use of AI. It's a great way to regulate AI when government is using it, and also set the standards for everyone else. And finally is investing in regulatory capacity, transportation, healthcare, consumer protection, giving them the tools and expertise to oversee AI, because it's their jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's great. Our colleague Daniel Castro just wrote a piece about AI in the freight rail industry, and an enormous set of opportunities to use AI to streamline and cut costs and improve safety. But you have this regulatory uncertainty about it. You have regulators that simply don't understand it. And when you don't understand something, you want to sort of put the brakes on. Jim, over to you, and then we'll see which one of you won the poll.
Well, one prediction would be that we're going to have 2 years of chaos and then 2 years of, because I think there'll be buyer's remorse when we come to the midterms. Another prediction is that there's some China that needed to be broken. So it's possible that if we can break that China, if we can move to a more reasonable Democratic Party, or if you see a more centrist Republican Party, we could actually come out better out of all this. That doesn't mean the next 4 years will be better, but 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, there were things that we needed to give up on. And so pushing on that, even in a sort of unfortunate way, is good. I don't know which it'll be. I mean, if they can be as reasonable as some of them are when you talk to them, I think it'll be a good outcome. I am worried about the Democratic Party because they're in serious trouble, and I'm not sure they're ready to admit to it. We all thought it would be the Republicans who would be on the ropes, and it turned out that's not the case. But overall, some China that needed to be broken, a chaotic situation, and then my bet is gridlock in the last 2 years.
Well, that's sort of optimistic given Washington, Jim. I do agree on the China breaking. Lots of things that need changing, and I'd get rid of NEPA personally. I don't see what the point of it is on non-federal land. And certainly it seems like just on something like that now there's enough oomph to really at least begin to reform it. And there's many, many other things like that. We don't know what's going to happen with the new DOGE. I guess it has a new name under the new executive order, but massive opportunities in the federal government to use IT to improve it, build quality, cut costs, cut staff. Is it going to be done? Is it going to be done right? Who knows, but certainly lots of opportunities. So if that, we can close out by just doing a quick look at the final poll. And Sarah, you won the case there. We need better spectrum allocation, and 2024 is the year to go. I'll put the two AIs together, and if we do that, actually AI wins now ahead of spectrum. Export controls, getting those right, still pretty important. Whoa, that's interesting. Alrighty. Hey, I want to thank everybody. This was a great event, really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. I really appreciated you taking the time and coming up with your specific examples and elucidating them so clearly to everybody. And I want to thank everybody who joined us on the panel. And here's looking to a productive, exciting, and positive year for tech innovation.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.